All right, we've got lots of questions. There's no way we're going to get to all of them. And it's interesting because we don't have time to prepare these. We just looked at them during this song, right at the end, really. So you get what you get. Here's how we'll do it. We'll take a question and we'll each try to answer within 60 seconds. The sound team in the back will put a timer up because we're so formal around here. And we'll do our best to stay within 60 seconds. And we'll wrap things up by, 20 after?
Right, for communion.
For communion.
Yeah.
Let's dive into these. Good questions.
So the first one is a quick answer. Is there an online link to make donations to Hurricane Harvey? Yes. On the church website, if you go to giving, donate, give to us, I'm not quite sure what that button is.
It's actually on the home page, and it says Hurricane Harvey Relief, I believe. But it's on the home page. You can't miss it.
So, yes. I don't think we need 2 minutes for that.
Yes.
So we're going to randomly grab these.
All right, let's do it.
And we're going to start deep. An 8th grade boy who attends our children's school shot himself on the playground this week. How can we see the lost boys and the bobbies in our own community so that we can help them through their struggles? I'm going to answer that one as a mom. If you haven't heard, we had 3 suicides in the Denver metro area, 2 in Littleton, 1 in Arvada this week. And like many of you, I struggle with how to respond to that. I have a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old daughter. And so we had to sit down with them and have conversations. And the 14-year-old, we've had these conversations. The 11-year-old, we hadn't yet. And so this weekend, James and I sat down with Kaylee and had a conversation about suicide and mental health and what it means to be in community together and help each other. And I think the biggest key that we as a country, society are not good at is acknowledging the reality. It's really hard to talk about suicide and mental health, and so we shy away from it, both as parents and as communities and as a church as well. And so I think as a community, we respond by being honest about the reality and creating a space for conversation.
Yeah, so the question is, how can we help them through their struggles in our own community so that we can help them through our struggles? How can we see them? You know what's really interesting is we are at an all-time high in communication, and we're at an all-time low in connection. Which is really fascinating, isn't it? Because look at all the social media we have, and Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and then we have email, and we still have old school models like newspapers and telephones and texting, and communication isn't the problem, but we have a really low thing of connection. So I think the question becomes, how do we connect? Or what are we missing when it comes to connection? And so I have a friend who talks about, she says, how do we rediscover new bumpers? Because we've lost our bumpers. If you think about a bowling lane and the bumpers, they're the things that keep the ball going down the alley. We've lost the things in our culture that keep us going down the straight path. So it's not about getting back. We're never going to get back to the old days. So when people say, well, if we could just go back to that year or that decade, well, that's not happening. How do we rediscover bumpers that keep us together? And so I think it's a question about connection. Was that?
It started at 0 and went up.
Oh, so I have another 30 seconds.
No, you already took.
I took the 30 seconds. Oh, shoot. Jessica, I'm going to throw it to you.
You want to start the next one?
Yes. Here we go. It seems a fine line between coming off judgy and denying God when speaking about our faith to someone who is unchurched. When to speak up or just listen, for example, when someone says, the universe led me down this path. When to me, that is surely God, the Holy Spirit. What are your thoughts on this fine line? It's a great question.
It is a great question.
Shall I start?
Yeah.
I'll start, then throw it to you?
Sure.
Okay. So I think the question, if I'm understanding it correctly, is it's a question of languaging. So the universe led me here. That language doesn't bother me at all. Because in this culture, we have to be open to how others are experiencing the idea, the thing that is bigger than themselves. So people have been burned by church. They've been burned by religious experiences. So when they say the universe led me here, I can translate that as God or whatever language works for me. But the question becomes, do I care what they label God? Do I care what they name God? And if we look through the scriptures, there are literally dozens of names for God. Because you are describing, and our language is so inadequate here, we're describing something that's bigger than ourselves. It's done something to us. We've had an experience with this. So what is that thing? There's my minute.
One of the things ministers are taught in seminary is to answer a question with a question. So my response is often with a question, but I would have responded with asking that person, what did they mean by the universe? To delve deeper, because sometimes we hear someone give an answer and we assume to know what they meant, and then we can be judgy about it, rather than taking that next step of delving deeper. Well, what do you mean by the universe led you to something? And then is it about us having to have the same understanding, or is it about us having an ability to talk and be in conversation? And I actually think when people word things different, it's the best opportunity to delve deeper in a conversation rather than decide that they're saying it wrong or experiencing it wrong. Asking, what did that mean? And then being able to say, once you understand what it means to them, oh, this is how I experience it, and this is how I view it, and engaging that conversation at a deeper level. So,
good question.
That is a great one. Okay, the shack gave me new insights into how to process and think through my own great sadness. Where have you seen tragedy or great sadness in your own life lead to a more reverent understanding of how God acts and reacts in your world?
Light question.
Yeah. When I was 13, I was a member at Westminster United Methodist Church, and our associate pastor was killed on the church property by her estranged husband, who then shot himself on the church property. And it is a formational experience for why I am clergy. I didn't understand that at the time. It was a tragedy, and it was a communal tragedy. Not only was it a tragedy for her family, it was a tragedy for our church. And it took a while as a church to heal from it, but it wasn't until that experience that I understood the possibility of what church could be and how a community could come together in support of one another. And it was great sadness for everyone. And yet it was also a moment of profound healing and recognition of God's presence as a community. I think some of our most tragic experiences are often revelations of God's presence.
Beautiful. So the question is about tragedies, and essentially what do we do with those tragedies? How has it shaped our understanding of who God is in the world? I think tragedy in my life has helped me. It is the thing that has allowed me to ask better and deeper questions. It's the thing that strips everything away from you. So if you think about those moments in your life where you've had everything stripped from you, that's what we call tragedy. So for me, and I've spoken about these moments often, but the moment of hearing the news of my brother's death, very tragic moment for me. In the months and years afterwards, the moment of walking into my first 12-step meeting and saying those dreadful words that I never wanted to say, my name's Ryan and I'm an alcoholic. Man, that was a moment when everything was stripped from me. And so you come to a place where if you have nothing left, then you're allowed to ask any question you need to ask. If you have nothing left, then you're allowed to imagine God in the most real and raw form. And those moments are when I've experienced God on the deepest level. That's when I've experienced grace on the deepest level. Next question.
You get to start
Yeah,
this
we are
one.
flying through these. And
it's a 3-word question.
what is hell?
With a smiley face.
With a smiley face. So it's certainly not a smiley face.
With a smiley face.
You know what's interesting about this question is we've talked about doing an entire sermon series on this question. And so we might just have to do it. So let's talk about it in its simplest form. Hell is when you, so let me speak for myself. It is when you are separated from everything that's meaningful. When you are separated from God, others, yourself. When you live in isolation, you are living in hell. So is it an eternal state? Because I think the question usually hinges, is God so bad that you can do something so wrong that God is going to ultimately send you to a place of fire forever? Not that there's redemption in it, but you're going to be there forever. Well, theoretically, yeah, you can be in that place forever. You could choose isolation forever. You can choose to be disconnected from the most meaningful things. I can't imagine it. I can't imagine that anyone would choose to be disconnected forever. Is it a theoretical possibility? Yes. Is it a theological possibility? I can't imagine it. God is better than that. And if we approach it through the idea of a parent, I can never imagine saying to my daughters or my son, you've done something so bad, go into that dark closet, not just for a little while, but go there forever. I can't imagine it. And the scriptures don't lend themselves to it either, but that's for another day.
I sat in with the Gap group on Wednesday night with a class, and we were talking about sin. And sin is one of those touchy theological words that many Christians have rejected because of how it's been used to abuse for centuries. But I told my definition of sin is that which separates us from God. Those actions that I take that separate me from God, for me, are sinful. And I connect that with hell in the way, a lot like Ryan said, when I choose actions that time and time again separate me from God, I create my own sense of hell. When I separate myself from relationship, not only with God, but with each other, or when I'm unable to recognize the divine in other people and see the good in people and places around, that's hell. The inability to understand, recognize, be in relationship with God is, I can't imagine anything worse than not believing that God is with you and choosing then to live in a way that denies that.
2 quick book recommendations for that. C.S. Lewis, The Great Divorce. If you want to begin thinking about these issues, C.S. Lewis has a great book. And Rob Bell, Love Wins. 2 very good books on this subject.
Yeah. Was the warden in Cool Hand Luke a bad guy or a guy doing a bad job? That's a great question.
I almost want to make this person raise their hand so we can have a great conversation.
Oh, he did.
Oh, so that's such a great question.
It is a great question.
I'll start, then you finish.
Okay.
Was he a bad guy? If you remember some in the Holocaust who were driving the trains, they said, we're just doing our job. Just doing our job. Which is such a poignant point in our society. Because how do you separate yourself, your heart, from just doing your job? So was he a bad guy? And that would be pretty judgmental for us to say, yeah, he was just a bad guy. Just bad heart. But was he doing a bad thing? Yeah. Yeah, and it's why when we talk about issues of sin, it's systemic. It's not just individual. This is why talking about it as a system is so important, because oftentimes, even in our jobs, we participate in sin. It may not be who we are right here, but we participate. If you think of things like racism, we participate in racism sometimes without even knowing it, because we benefit from a system that hurts others. I didn't mean to turn it in such a direction, but I'm thinking systemically here.
I always come to the thought of you get to make a choice on what job you do, and you get to choose whether or not to do the job. So that simple reasoning of it's not me, it's the job, you chose the job, or you chose to stay in the job. And so I don't think it's as easy as separating who we are from what we do. I think what we do tells the world who we are. I don't think our faith is separated from our actions. I think our actions speak to our faith. So if we are in a job that we believe is wrong, or something about it isn't something we should participate in because of our faith, the faith leads us to question whether to stay in the job. So I don't think you can separate the two as if one is here and one is here. I think they are mingled together. And if we feel like the job is wrong, then we have to question, can we stay in it?
Integrity issue.
Right. Yep. All right, you can start that one.
I'm not sure I can read it. Should we not explain UMCOR's relation to the church, world service, the ecumenical service body of churches?
Body of the church.
Yes, we should explain that. I think I'm guessing the person who asked this wants more than a yes or no. You want to explain that?
Sure. So UMCOR, United Methodist Committee on Relief, is an organization out of the general church. So the big body of the church. It's run through one of our United Methodist agencies. And it is connected, if you remember, every year we have what's either called, now it's called UMCOR Sunday. And we give a special offering to UMCOR Sunday, and that pays for all of the administrative costs of UMCOR, which is why when we do collections like today, 100% can go to where it needs to go to the disaster relief. And so UMCOR is run by the bigger entity of the church, funded by all of the local churches around the globe who take that offering, and connected then to organizations and entities actually around the world. There are many times when other agencies come to UMCOR to partner with UMCOR when there was malaria outbreak and Ebola outbreak. Because of our connections and structures through UMCOR and the general church body, we are in a prime place to be first responders, and then UMCOR is often the last one out. The Methodists like to say we're the first ones in and we're the last ones out. Many of the relief agencies are there for the crisis itself. UMCOR sticks around for the rebuilding as well. So UMCOR is a great organization for the full time period of any tragedy or crisis around the globe. So they're in Montana right now. There's been flooding in Nepal and India. We have UMCOR folks there as well. And it's because of our connectional structure that happens. You asked me about Methodism, and I take more than a minute.
Clearly.
Always. Okay. I'm going to let you have that one then, maybe.
How could a loving God allow something like Hurricane Harvey to happen? Wow, that's not a light question either. So I think that becomes the question of evil in our world. The question of, does God create evil? Does God allow evil? What about free will? Do we have free will? So let me answer my own questions. Yes, we have free will. And in order to have free will, that means bad things can happen in the world. So if we have free will, that means we also live in a world that is free to hurt people. You are free to hurt others. Bad things are free to happen. Does God create it and allow it? No. No, I think God is asking of us, how will you respond? So could God have stopped Hurricane Harvey? This may be a controversial issue. I would say no, God could not have stopped Hurricane Harvey. Well, then does that mean God's not all-powerful? No, God is all-powerful when it comes to categories of love. When it comes to categories of grace, God is all-powerful. Can God go around and stop tragedies? Well, then why wouldn't God stop the Holocaust? And if God could have stopped that and didn't, do I really want to participate with that God? And then the question becomes, well, maybe God let it go because something greater could happen because of it. Wow, such a bigger question than we can address in 1 minute. But I think it comes to the question of evil in the world and tragedy.
One of the things I remember reading about or thinking through was that God also created the randomness, the ability for randomness. And if God's going to create a world in which randomness can happen, then you can have hurricanes and tornadoes and floods and avalanches and those natural disasters that we wish God just wouldn't have allowed to happen, is the way it's often used. But if God created randomness, then God created the structures. And hurricanes are only now tragic because we live in the places that the hurricane hits. Is the hurricane itself bad? Or is it neutral? Is it just, it is? And now the situation has been created for people to be living where a hurricane hits and tragedy happens. Does that mean the hurricane was bad and God let it happen? Does that mean there's neutrality and randomness in the world, and how we respond speaks to who we are and who God is?
And that question has come up a couple of times. And it always seems to hinge on how do we respond. So rather than trying to say, well, did God cause this? Did God allow this? Maybe the better question is, how do we respond as Christians? How do we respond as the church? Because how we respond matters.
Do we have time for one more?
We've got one more.
Okay.
How do you know God and Jesus have forgiven you and have forgiven you of mistakes you've made? I think when you no longer carry around that shame, when you no longer carry around that guilt, that's when you know you've experienced forgiveness. How do you know when you've forgiven others? When you can pass them in the grocery store and you no longer hate them. You no longer see them and you say, oh my goodness, I got to turn and go the other way. When you're no longer going to bed at night with all that anger and resentment. When you're no longer wishing that they would get hit by a train. These are real categories of forgiveness. When you no longer are consumed with ideas of revenge. So too many times people think of forgiveness as, well, I've got to go to that person, we've got to be best friends, and we've got to meet for coffee once a week now. No, you don't. No, you don't. You need to make things right, and then you live openly and you let that thing go. That's how you experience forgiveness. Let me say that. That's how I experience forgiveness. That's how I've experienced it.
I separate God's forgiveness from my self-forgiveness. I believe that God always forgives. And accepting that forgiveness leads to our own self-forgiveness, which then frees us from the anger, the pain, the holding on, the resentment, the desire for revenge. But I first start with this core belief that God always forgives. First, that it's not contingent on anything. That's part of God's grace, is this immediate forgiveness. What I do with that is then up to me. And do I allow God's forgiveness to work in me to then create that space for self-forgiveness and forgiveness of others? And when I can move into forgiveness of self and forgiveness of others, there is that freeing of the pain. It doesn't necessarily take everything away. I think people often think forgiveness means that you're just okay now. And I don't think forgiveness works that way. I think forgiveness is a process. I think we can still remember what happened, or we can still recognize that what we did was wrong, and part of forgiveness is then we change the behavior. But I don't ever question that God forgives first. Instantaneous, immediately, it is there without us even asking for it. God's grace, God's forgiveness, God's love just is.
Can I close things with a quote?
Before you do that, we want to let you know that we didn't get to many questions, but Ryan and I are trying to figure out a way to address them all. So whether we write something up or do a Facebook Live or come up with another forum to address all the questions, there are still 3 or 4 or 5 more from this service. We want to address everyone's questions, so we'll figure out how best to do that. And if you have an idea, let us know.
Yeah, we'd love your feedback on this project. We had fun with it. We hope you did too. This is a quote I found, came across this week from a book by Rob Bell. It's called What is the Bible? The adult education class is using this book in their study. And it comes from his very opening page, and he quotes a poet by the name of Rainer Rilke. And he says, try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms, like books that are written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given because you would not be able to live them, And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer.